knew, didn't you? You felt it long before the first apparent break occurred or the loud scream of the fall. While the whole neighborhood sits in startled silence, their mouths hanging open in amazement, as if this tragedy came out of nowhere, you lean back. You're not shocked. You're not surprised. You're sitting back with that peaceful, knowing look, the same one you had months, if not years before, when you predicted this. You were the prophet in the desert, calling forth a warning that went unheard. They dismissed you. They called you paranoid, too intense and theatrical. They hissed, "You're just someone who overthinks everything." But now, the cruel, incontrovertible reality they can't bear is staring them in the face, and your gentle wisdom resonates in the cold stillness of their destruction. You never predicted the future using a mythical crystal ball. You were merely awake. You were the only one who dared to keep your eyes open while everyone else was playing pretend, their eyes wide open, but their brains closed against any uncomfortable reality. Your spiritual talent, a divine antenna linked directly to the source, has always been the capacity to interpret life at frequencies that others are unaware exist. While they were captivated and thrilled by the sparkling surface displays, you were tuned in at a deeper level. You were listening to the unsaid symphony of intents, noticing the slight change in energy that preceded the storm, feeling the tangible tension that swelled in every quiet pause, and detecting the startling inconsistency that vibrated beneath every carefully constructed statement. You paid attention to what wasn't spoken because you knew that the most profound truths are frequently hidden in the spaces. You listened to the pauses, which shouted more truthfully than the talks ever could. You observed the small but revealing changes in behavior, the short pause, the flicker in the eye, and the forced grin that didn't quite reach the soul. Where others were completely duped by false confidence, artificial charm, and distracting noise, you could see the hairline fissures in the mask. You could see the desperation underneath the bravado. You've been through enough, lost enough, been lied to by this world to know with piercing clarity when anything, no matter how polished and wonderful it seems, just doesn't fit. This isn't paranoia. It's divinely polished and hard-earned pattern identification. It is spiritual discernment sharpened by the flames of betrayal. And, although you may not have noticed it at the time, 3 separate and profound truths were developing inside you, forming a holy trinity that would soon erupt into blinding clarity. The first discovery was extremely personal, realizing that your sensitivity, which you and others had long seen as a crippling weakness, was really a highly tuned spiritual radar, a gift from above. The second discovery was social, seeing with terrible clarity that what masqueraded as community, tribe, or family was often a well-rehearsed act, a stage play of belonging. The third, the most shattering and world-altering epiphany, was systemic, acknowledging the unchanging spiritual rule that everything erected on a foundation of denial, delusion, and deception is doomed to dissolution. You understood a reality that many people still fiercely oppose. Momentum is not the same as stability. Loudness is not equivalent to strength. While they were given standing ovations for appearances, you were silently and methodically researching structural integrity. While everyone praised the empty message, you investigated the true motivation. And, while others were utterly lost in the seductive cacophony, you remained grounded enough in your soul to sense the fractures growing deep underneath it all. Everything changed the instant you had the fortitude to speak out, to express the unpleasant truth that was throbbing in your spirit. It was not because you were incorrect, but exactly because you were correct, long before anybody else was willing to confront the truth. When the reality appears too early at a party where illusions are offered, people do not just ignore it. They see it as a danger. They attempt to attack it, discredit it, suppress it, and, finally, destroy it. You became the issue just by being truthful. You were the mirror they refused to look at, so they attempted to break you. The response came in waves, each intended to damage your confidence and sanity. It began with ridicule behind your back and murmurs in darkened places. Then came the piercing sarcasm directed at your face, carefully veiled insults masquerading as jokes that were never, ever jokes. You spoke out of genuine concern for the collective, but they saw your words as a direct challenge to their comfy narrative. Your wisdom was seen as a declaration of war. Nonetheless, you knew. You knew that deep down, in the quietest parts of their souls, they were experiencing the same tremors as you. They just were not bold enough to confront the pain. So, rather than face the awful reality you revealed, they chose a far easier target: you. They made you the scapegoat, the official cause of all the unpleasantness, enabling them to avoid confronting truth. This chapter of your enlightenment showed you the deep and agonizing loneliness that comes with seeing too much, too fast. You were already facing the harsh truth of tomorrow, whilst others were still clinging to and enjoying yesterday's lovely, soothing fantasy. Every contact became a monument to fatigue. You were attempting to explain the mechanics of storm clouds to folks who were completely hooked to artificial sunlight. You were warning of significant structural flaws to those who were fixated on painting another new coat of paint. They consistently find it simpler to insult the messenger than to accept and incorporate the information. Laughing is simpler than listening. It is simpler to describe you as insane, highly emotional, or negative than to concede, even to oneself, that you may be correct. So they clung to their shared delusions with a frantic, white-knuckled hold, earnestly hoping that your speech was just meaningless noise. Because if you were right, if your vision was correct, everything they had built their lives and identities on would fall to rubble. But you never sought attention. You clearly were not attempting to play the part of a doomsday prophet. You were just refusing to remain blind in a society where everyone else considered denial a holy and vital right. The most difficult aspect of this whole affair was not that you were correct. It was somewhere you never wanted to be. You didn't want upheaval or covertly pray for someone's ruin. You spoke out because your intuition, your God-given connection to the truth, refused to allow you remain quiet. You spoke out because your spirit couldn't lie to yourself as easily as others did. While they held stubbornly to the soothing stories they wanted to believe, you took the difficult but freeing decision to embrace what was truly happening right in front of you. And that level of transparency, that uncompromising candor, comes at a high cost. It costs you comfort. It costs you relationships. It might cost you your peace of mind for a while. Because once you've seen the truth, the veil of illusion is irrevocably removed. There's no turning back. There is no way to return to the wonderful ignorance you previously had. You can't unsee the subtle manipulation, feel the phony loyalty, or hear the scripts individuals speak to keep themselves and others around them comfortable sleeping. And when you sought to communicate what you witnessed in the hopes of saving others from the unavoidable anguish, you were met with contempt and hostility. You were characterized as a pessimist, a troublemaker, and someone who was constantly destroying the moment with awkward, buzz-killing facts. During this lonely period, a tremendous and irrevocable alteration occurred deep inside you. Your internal compass, or spiritual GPS, was silently realigning itself. It was learning with remarkable precision how to distinguish between genuine, soul-level connection and phony, theatrical bonding. It wasn't a talent you intentionally aspired to master. It was a survival instinct bred from far too many meetings with masks and terrible emotional mirages. You were not aiming to bring down anybody or anything. You were attempting to avoid a cataclysmic collapse that only you seemed to perceive with such agonizing, crystalline clarity. You were the lighthouse, standing steadfast in the roaring storm, urgently guiding the ships away from the jagged rocks of tragedy. However, in their blindness, they misunderstood your warning ray for a danger to their intended path. You were labeled the issue, the disturbance, and the threat, when in reality, you were the warning signal, the final chance, attempting to safeguard the same things they professed to love. They dubbed you the fire, not comprehending you were urgently attempting to keep one from engulfing everything they valued. As time passed, you started to feel something they couldn't quite identify. Long before obvious degradation appeared, a creeping, unseen rot had already begun. The group's original brightness faded, leaving behind something cold, brittle, and false. What was previously vibrant, spontaneous, and authentic now seemed perfectly prepared. Genuine enthusiasm transformed into a hollow display. Smiles grew tight and strained. Praise lost its warmth and became a medium of trade. The room, which had previously been electric with possibilities, now seemed heavy, sluggish, and distant, as if the very air in the space sensed that something vital was dying. But nobody wanted to confess it. They were too preoccupied with capturing flawless moments for their highlight reels to see how the truth was quietly eroding the ground under their feet. While others were still frantically clinging to their shattered illusions, you were already mourning. You were mourning what it used to be, or what you thought it was. You'd seen the genuine fire in their eyes diminish and transform into a simple show. You had lamented the loss of reality while they were still applauding for the spectacle. As a result, when the inevitable collapse occurred, you did not flinch. You did not respond with amazement, fury, or a self-righteous, "I told you so." You couldn't. You had already borne the enormous emotional weight of this ending in stoic quiet long before they were willing to recognize that anything was wrong. This is the exact moment your second, more deep shift started. Not in outright revolt, but in calm, deliberate withdrawal. You stopped speaking. Not because you had nothing more to say. In fact, your heart was full with unsaid truths, but because you finally realized that your truth was not safe in their hands. Every time you attempted to speak truthfully, your words were twisted, distorted, repackaged, and used as weapons against you. They weren't listening to comprehend, but to gather ammo. So you accepted a strategic and holy quiet, created from hard-earned knowledge rather than fear. You came to the profound conclusion that defending your truth sometimes requires holding it pure, keeping it close to your heart rather than exposing it to people who just want to analyze, distort, or destroy it. Your quiet, which they misunderstood for capitulation or defeat, grew louder and more forceful than any argument you could have presented. It was the moment you stopped wanting to be understood by them and started prepared for the storm you knew was coming. People noticed when your voice dropped out of the discourse. They muttered, assuming you'd run out of things to say, lost your edge, or had given up the battle. What they didn't grasp and couldn't fathom was that your silence was a significant act of power. It was your attempt to recapture your energy and control in a world where your words had become ammo for others. And while they continued to misinterpret you, another life-changing realization dawned on you. Your job was never to persuade them. It was to remain grounded in your own reality while the world around you unraveled and learned its own truths via hard, direct experience. It was never about demonstrating a point. It was about being spiritually and emotionally ready for the aftermath. Every single individual who ignored your warnings and derided your worry was unintentionally removing themselves from the magnificent future you were quietly and tirelessly building. Even in your quiet moments, you were creating something meaningful. While they held hard to their illusions and staged a fake unity for the audience, you were discovering others. You were discovering your actual tribe, souls who had seen through the mask and experienced the same horrible discord. You discovered your people not in a group that agreed on every little detail, but in a holy partnership bound by a fiery and unrelenting commitment to truth over convenience and clarity over conformity. These were not the people who cheered loudly from the sidelines when it was trendy and safe to do so. These were fighters, people who would rise and support you even if it meant jeopardizing everything. You developed the vital ability of distinguishing between those who want genuine, profound change and others who just wanted a front-row ticket to the theater. The spectators enjoyed the sight of revolt as long as it did not involve their name, presence, or sacrifice. But the warriors, your genuine soul family, came up when it counted the most. They did not flinch as the pressure increased. They understood that genuine builders don't need onlookers. They need more builders and visionaries who are prepared to get their hands filthy in order to bring something tangible and long-lasting into being. After a little delay, I made my decision. If this message resonates deeply inside your soul, if you feel recognized and acknowledged in this holy place, we welcome you to join our expanding family here at God Connection. Click the subscribe button and enable alerts so you never miss a message intended for you. Your presence and energy contribute to the creation of this sanctuary of truth. Those who feel a strong call to support our goal and help us spread this light may become key partners in our effort. Please consider giving your enthusiastic support by making a $10 payment using the Super Thanks button just below this video. Every gift, regardless of size, is much appreciated and helps us to continue developing material that wakes and strengthens individuals like you. Your contribution helps to maintain this heavenly connection strong and clear. Now, let us return to the reality that is unfolding. During this stage of your awakening, you observed something much more painful than derision or rejection. You saw devotion turn into leverage. What seemed to be togetherness and a common, lofty aim gradually revealed itself as a succession of deliberate, strategic connections. People were establishing alliances because it seemed secure, lucrative, or politically expedient, not because they believed in anything greater than themselves. And when the winds of fortune turned, so did their loyalties. This was not due to growth or a real change of heart. It wasn't a revelation. It was just self-interest. They had the arrogance to call it evolution, but your spirit, your highly tuned internal compass, saw it for what it was: opportunism in its most deceptive form. You could feel it in the subtle shifts, in the way they started to talk in cautious half-truths, in the way they carefully maintained just enough distance from any commitment to avoid blame if things went wrong. However, calling it out openly would have been worthless. It would only have made you seem resentful or paranoid, reinforcing the false narrative they had constructed about you. Instead, you watched in tremendous quiet as individuals showed their real loyalties, not when things were easy, but when standing hard for the truth would cost them something. That's when you knew, with chilling certainty, that some individuals were never devoted to the truth, the purpose, or you. They were only ever committed to their own comfort. And as soon as their comfort was jeopardized, so did their character. This terrifying realization combined with something much deeper and far more disturbing. The community you previously believed in, the holy circle you thought kept you safe, started to reveal its actual shape. What looked to be a real friendship had turned into intricate, high-stakes staging. Every so-called breakthrough was accompanied by prepared, artificial clapping, meticulously crafted outfits, and secret scripts. The further you looked, the more levels of artifice you discovered. Hidden power structures were camouflaged as equality, covert rivalries as cooperation, and subtle, manipulative manipulations as kind leadership. People were not connecting souls. They were networking profile by profile, much like brands at a cold, sterile conference. Every meeting began to seem like a bazaar, with everyone selling a polished, marketable version of themselves. Authenticity did not just vanish in such a shallow environment. It was aggressively banished. You started to recognize the patterns with clear, devastating precision. You saw how discussions began to seem scripted, and how certain buzzwords and phrases were repeated like hypnotic chants to sustain the fragile appearance of togetherness. Words with holy, deep significance, such as development, authenticity, and community, have been emptied out, stripped of potency, and weaponized. They had devolved into nothing more than marketing phrases, used to promote a lifestyle rather than embodying a real truth. When individuals said transformation, they actually meant a more polished social media presence. When they spoke about healing, it wasn't about finding depth or completeness. It was about turning their misery into a relevant, consumable commodity. The most distressing discovery, however, was not the empty words. It was how disagreement had developed into a sickness. Questioning the mainstream narrative was not only incorrect, it was also poisonous, negative, or out of alignment. Dissent was diagnosed rather than argued. Anyone who dared to think critically, explore nuance, or ask a difficult question was immediately labeled as resistant to growth or stuck in their ego. You watched in silent heartbreak as intelligent, capable souls trained themselves out of their own discernment, terrified that too much depth or critical thought would exile them from the only community they thought they had. And that's when the most awful reality struck you. What you thought was a community was really just a brilliantly produced, grandiose costume party. At first, there seemed to be a sense of purpose, togetherness, and a tribe marching together in truth. But the more you remained, the farther the curtain was drawn back. The assistance seemed forced and mechanical. Compliments were given with a prepared, exaggerated excitement, but only while others were looking. Praise became performance. Applause became cash. What had been portrayed as a true community was really an ongoing audition room in which everyone performed a part to keep the frail illusion going. You began to realize that love was no longer unconditional. It was utterly transactional. People were valued based on their reach, clout, platform, and usefulness rather than their heart, integrity, or soul. Relationships were established via exposure rather than trust. Visibility had entirely replaced vulnerability. Convenience far outweighed connection. And if you didn't follow the unwritten norms, or refused to put on the costume and read from their script, you were silently and gradually removed. Not because you were incorrect, but because your genuine sincerity shattered their carefully constructed fantasy. This location that seemed like a family turned out to be a marketplace. Loyalty has a price tag. Praise came with unseen strings attached. And when you stopped feeding their image, you disappeared. Not because you lost worth, but because you no longer fit the story they were promoting. That's what hurt the most deeply. It wasn't simply the loss. It was a deep feeling of betrayal. Because you showed up as your true, genuine self. You had genuinely cared. You really believed in the mission. You had put your heart and soul into something you considered precious. However, your authenticity had become raw material, mined and utilized to power a machine that refined honesty into content, transforming your truth into a well-curated brand. Your vulnerability established them credibility. Your hard-earned ideas were repackaged and presented as their own knowledge. Your progress, your painstaking, hard-earned change, was turned into a public success story. You were not part of a community. You were a resource to be extracted, reused, and discarded. This enlightenment carried with it a loneliness that went deeper than simple solitude. It was the type of loneliness that comes when you realize you've been surrounded by people who have entirely forgotten what true, genuine connection feels like. They'd exchanged authenticity for plaudits, depth for confirmation, and soul for strategy. And once you've seen that horrific encounter, you could never forget it. You already knew the game was rigged, but this was something completely else. This wasn't just about a failing system. It was about the heartbreaking realization that what you thought was love, what you thought was togetherness, was really a superb performance. Around the same time, another unsettling trend started to emerge, one that could not be ignored. Individuals who positioned themselves as leaders were not really leading. They were feeding. They were feasting on the energy, attention, and holy trust of people who really desired reform. Their choices were not motivated by a supernatural vision or purpose. Rather, they were calculated efforts to keep themselves in the limelight, to preserve their position of adulation and power. Every emotional speech, big vision, and so-called call to action was about maintaining their own fragile ego rather than raising others. You watched how they intentionally surrounded themselves with individuals who would never confront them, how they created environments in which disagreement was not only discouraged, but seen as a symptom of spiritual illness. A single honest inquiry was enough to have someone sent out, not because the question was incorrect, but because it undermined the illusion they had worked so hard to maintain. What the world saw as leadership was nothing more than performance art. And what seemed to be wisdom was really a well-rehearsed script of rehashed platitudes, catchy slogans, and empty affirmations designed to elicit applause, but providing no real content or insight. They had perfected the illusion of depth. Their words danced gracefully in the air, but landed nowhere significant. They talked ceaselessly about transformation, but never allowed anything essential to alter, since true change would entail abandoning the very pedestal on which their whole identity was built. You started to recognize the deeper, more evil game. Crises were created to retain their relevance. They manufactured difficulties in order to portray themselves as saviors, altering narratives so that they were always seen as the answer to the same turmoil they had covertly produced. It was a vicious cycle of drama and salvation, meant to keep their followers emotionally hooked, spiritually confused, and perpetually in need of their guidance. Through shared anger, faked urgency, and emotional instability, they created a false feeling of connection. They trauma bonded with their followers, giving the impression of intimacy by tapping into unresolved traumas and portraying themselves as the only ones capable of understanding or healing them. The most terrible discovery occurred when you realized how they weaponized sincerity. They preyed on genuine searchers' desires, people who were really dedicated to personal development and self-discovery. They transformed the holy yearning for truth into a type of spiritual consumerism. Enlightenment became a commodity. Healing was advertised as a premium service. Wisdom was offered in pricey bundles, exclusive memberships, and limited-time material. Their whole platform evolved into a sophisticated economic strategy camouflaged as a spiritual endeavor. What shocked you to the core was how they gently and consistently separated individuals from their own inner knowledge. They persuaded individuals to question their own senses, to barter their divine intuition for the leader's praise, using methods like love bombing and cunning gaslighting. What seemed to be empowerment was really hidden dependence. What seemed to be liberty was really control disguised as a compelling outfit. You've outgrown their story. You did it unapologetically. They had put you in a character that suited them well, one in which you remained acceptable, predictable, and little. You were a supporting character who did not dispute the storyline, question the motivations, or disturb the continuous flow of adulation they had painstakingly cultivated for themselves. True development, or soul expansion, does not need permission. And when your development no longer suited the role they had assigned for you, your very existence became a disturbance. Your expansion disturbed the very core of their tale. Not because you were incorrect, but because you stopped trying to fit their script. Your progress seemed like rebellion to them. Not because you were willfully rejecting them, but because your genuine growth undermined their capacity to control the narrative. When you stopped shrinking to match their comfort, their weak hold on the plot slipped utterly. You weren't attempting to undermine their authority. You were just embracing the wholeness of who you were always intended to be. However, for others who had emotionally and energetically invested in the smaller version of you, your genuine growth seemed like a profound and intimate betrayal. They did not regard your recovery as beautiful. Rather, they saw it as disobedience. However, this newfound freedom brought with it a new kind of difficulty, one that was fundamentally internal rather than external. As you walked away from their platform, robbed of the familiar scripts, characters, and applause, you were left in a wide, scary wasteland of unknown. The identity that had been deliberately molded to satisfy others was no longer valid. And in its absence, you were faced with the huge challenge of finding your own truth in the absence of daily affirmation and the community that had previously defined you. You were confronted with the most important question of all. Who am I underneath all of this conditioning? This stage of the voyage provided a unique, mystical combination of intense sadness and enormous relief. You lamented your feeling of belonging, even knowing that it had always existed only on the tight condition of your obedience. You lamented the connections that shattered and broke apart in the glaring light of your development, relationships that, in retrospect, had never completely accepted your true nature. You felt tremendous grief for the dreams you had created on the fragile, unstable foundation of illusion. However, woven within that tapestry of loss was a quiet, steady, and undeniable river of tranquility. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, you weren't acting. You weren't concealing your truth or eroding your strength for the sake of others. You weren't walking on emotional eggshells, always controlling everyone else's responses in order to be acceptable. You were just existing, unfiltered, unapologetic, and ultimately, gloriously free. What you formerly questioned about yourself, your deep sensitivity, your constant awareness, your steadfast reluctance to play along, has now been proven as great insight. The dynamics you saw in quiet have revealed universal patterns that exist not just in human relationships, but in whole collective systems. The flaws you saw were not isolated instances. They were part of a worldwide unraveling. And now, as circumstances unfold precisely as your soul predicted, every aspect of your awakening has fallen into place, revealing the greater, cosmic image you were always destined to view. Your trip through the woods was not just for your personal release. It was your initiation. It was spiritual strength training, preparing you to hold space for the many others who would one day find themselves in your shoes, confused, deceived, and frantically looking for what is genuine in an illusion-filled world. You did not choose to be a bridge between illusion and reality. It occurred because you experienced the transition. It occurred because you refused to succumb to complacency, choosing clarity above convenience. And now, the whispers you once carried alone, the instinctive warnings you previously doubted, are becoming the same words booming in rooms that are finally ready to hear them. You were never seeking vengeance. You weren't thirsty for attention. All you wanted was for the truth to stand on its own, without you having to drag it, defend it, or explain it to those who were determined to misunderstand you. You weren't resentful. You were just early. You were not contentious. You were just forthright. And you did not outgrow people because of ego. Rather, you outgrew the performance in which they needed you to engage. Now you stand in the aftermath, reverently rather than arrogantly. You're not celebrating being correct. You're recognizing the enormous guts required to remain awake in a society designed to send you to sleep. You're recognizing the tremendous fortitude it needed to choose development over acceptance, to reject comfortable falsehoods in favor of difficult facts. This is not the conclusion of the narrative. This is the beginning of your true tale, the one you were meant to live. Because you now understand your duty with heavenly clarity. You were never supposed to rescue everyone. Your purpose was to keep the possibility of salvation alive. You were not meant to repair every broken system. You were asked to create something better. You were picked for your authenticity rather than your popularity. In a culture that glorifies masks and promotes insincerity, your sensitivity was never a weakness. That was your superpower. Your deep seeing, deep feeling, and deep knowing were the same things that kept you grounded in reality while the rest of the world sought to lure you into its vast illusion. This was never something you had to conquer. It was something holy to cherish, divine to embrace, a calling woven into the very fabric of your being. Yes, the community is in shock right now, but you aren't surprised, because you were made to see what others cannot. You were supposed to read the signals that others disregarded, not as punishment, but as preparation, not as a prophecy, but as a precaution. You are an early warning system in a world that often waits until it is too late. Your mere presence dispels illusions and initiates awareness, not because you want to, but because it is who you are. Walk ahead now, chosen one, not in fear, but with total certainty. The world sorely needs your unique energy, grounded awakeness, unwavering clarity, and untamed truth. They need someone who can see clearly while everyone else is still seeing through rose-colored glasses. You were never broken by this incident. You were broken open so that more light could enter, more knowledge could flow out, and you could become the mighty vessel you were always intended to be. The ending you observed was not your demise, but rather the holy clearing for your new beginning. And what occurs next depends on you. It needs individuals like you, those with the vision to see through illusion, the heart to love through agony, and the strength to create something authentic, raw, and long-lasting. Your time of being misunderstood is up. You are currently entering a period of being crucial. The characteristics that formerly distinguished you as an outsider have now elevated you to the status of pioneer. Step into this holy duty with unwavering confidence, since every betrayal, awakening, lonely night, and silent truth has prepared you for this precise moment. The truth does not need permission to come. It only takes one courageous person to acknowledge it, another to repeat it, and another to live it out loud. You have always been a bold soul. It still is, and it always will be. Thank you for traveling this road of truth with us here at God Connection. If this message has awoken something within you, please show your support by liking this video, sharing it with others on their own awakening journey, and subscribing to our channel for more profound information. We want to hear from you. Leave a comment below about your personal experience and how you're embracing your truth. To help us continue this precious work and spread God's light over the world, please consider making a $10 gift using the Super Thanks button below. Every act of kindness, whether a prayer or a gift, feeds our work and gives hope to others. Stay connected, shine brightly, and face your divine destiny with bravery. We are pleased to share this adventure with you. Blessings, dear soul.